Good evening and welcome back, friends. Tonight we're diving into the fascinating world of the Roman Empire. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. The torches burned low against the marble walls of the Colosseum, their flames bending and snapping in the night wind. Smoke curled upward, painting the corridors in shifting shadows that seemed alive. Somewhere deep within those walls, cages rattled. The guttural growl of a lion broke the silence, followed by the shrill cry of a panther pacing its enclosure. The air was thick with the scent of straw, iron, and blood. Men shuffled forward, not as spectators, but as the hidden workforce behind the spectacle animal keepers, trainers, guards, and gladiators themselves, step echoing with the knowledge that dawn might never come for them. Imagine it, the roar of 50,000 Romans thundering like a storm overhead. Yet before the games even began, death was already at work in the corridors below. Lions lunged against their bars, their claws scraping sparks across iron. Elephants, chained and restless, shifted their massive weight, shaking the earth beneath the workers' feet. A single slip of a chain, a missed strike of the trainers. Staff and the arena would claim another victim before the audience ever saw the sand-stained red. Now, ask yourself, what would it feel like to wake each morning knowing that your job itself, the task you were paid or forced to perform, was a gamble with death? Not a soldier in battle, not a rebel hunted by Rome, but a worker, a laborer, a craftsman whose daily duties carried a sentence no law had to write. Would you sleep at night? Or would your dreams be haunted by the growls from the cages, the weight of the stones above your head, or the smell of lead dust clinging to your breath? History books love to tell us about emperors, senators, and generals. They speak of triumphs, victories, and architectural marvels, but rarely do they dwell on the hands that bled to build those monuments, or the men and women whose very survival depended on risking their lives in silence. The invisible workforce of Rome lived not in marble villas, but in shadows, where the price of error was not a demotion or dismissal, but death itself. And here lies the heart of the story. Beneath the grandeur of Rome, beneath its arches, its mosaics, its golden halls, were professions so perilous that to call them jobs is almost an insult. These were death sentences disguised as livelihoods. Jobs where poison lingered in the very air, where the swing of a sword was part of your morning routine, and where the applause of the crowd was sometimes the last sound you ever heard. Over the next hours, you will hear the untold accounts of these deadly professions, some spectacular, some hidden in the grime of Rome's underbelly, and others so strange they seem pulled from nightmares. From the men who faced wild beasts before breakfast, to the miners whose lungs filled with poison in the empire's dark tunnels, we will walk step by step into the shadows Rome tried to leave behind. But let this question guide you as we begin. If your job demanded your life as payment, would you accept the risk for glory, for survival, or simply because you had no choice? When most people picture ancient Rome, they imagine the shimmering surfaces of marble temples, the echo of sandals across polished floors, and the thunder of cenotes debating in the forum. They think of emperors draped in purple robes, feasts piled high with roasted boar and honey cakes, and gladiators striding into the arena beneath the roar of 50,000 voices. Rome has always been remembered for its grandeur, its victories, and the magnificence of its architecture. But what history books often gloss over is that the empire wasn't built on marble, it was built on blood, sweat, and the fragile bodies of millions of workers whose daily lives were defined by danger. Rome was not just emperors and generals. Behind every golden banquet, behind every aqueduct arching across the countryside, behind every amphitheater filled with spectacle, there were invisible laborers who risked everything to keep the empire alive. For every senator reclining in luxury, there were hundreds of slaves and freedmen hauling water, shaping stone, smelting iron, cleaning streets, or fighting beasts. Their names were rarely recorded. Their stories were rarely told. Yet without them, Rome's glittering facade would have crumbled into dust. Imagine the contrast. On one side, wealthy Romans lounged on couches, sipping wine sweetened with lead. Syrup, their servants, fanning them with peacock feathers while musicians played. On the other side, just beyond the villa walls, workers baked under the Mediterranean sun on dangerous scaffolds, hauling blocks of stone that could crush them in an instant. Inside, the laughter of banquets rang against walls lined with mosaics. Outside, miners descended into narrow shafts where air was poised with dust and metal fumes. Knowing they might not resurface alive, luxury was visible, risk was hidden. Rome was a stage, and the spotlight shone only on the powerful, while those who risked everything remained in shadow. Work in ancient Rome was more than a duty, was a matter of survival. For the enslaved, there was no choice at all. They labored until their bodies broke. For the poor free citizens, dangerous work was often the only chance to feed a family. And even for skilled craftsmen, fortune was fragile. One accident at a glass furnace, one slip of a chisel, and a lifetime of expertise meant nothing against the indifference of death. Unlike today, there were no safety harnesses, no unions, no laws protecting the vulnerable. Rome had no patience for weakness. If a worker fell, another was always waiting to take his place. This is the untold foundation of Rome's greatness. The empire stretched across continents, commanded legions, and shaped the destiny of the Western world. But it was held together not just by marble and laws, it was held together by expendable lives. The amphitheaters that dazzled crowds were built by hands calloused from stone and bloodied by accidents. The shimmering purple robes of emperors were dyed by workers suffocating in vats of poisonous mollusk brine. The wine that filled silver goblets was poured by servants who would never share in the feast. Now pause and ask yourself, would you trade your office, your workshop, your school, or your daily commute for the mines of Hispania, where men choked on poisonous dust in darkness for the promise of silver Rome craved? Would you exchange your cubicle or construction site for the sands of the Colosseum, where gladiators bled to entertain a restless mob? Could you imagine waking each morning knowing your work itself might kill you, not because of war, not because of rebellion, but because your role in society was considered disposable? That is the contrast that makes Rome so haunting. Its glory was dazzling, but it was built on invisible suffering. Every aqueduct meant water for cities, but also corpses crushed in its construction. Every road meant trade and travel, but also slaves dying in the ditches. Every banquet meant celebration, but also bakers coughing from flour dust, servants poisoned by fumes, and children forced into brutal apprenticeships. Rome was not just a civilization of luxury, it was a civilization of calculated risk, where Millions lived knowing their value extended only as far as their usefulness to the empire. As we step deeper into these stories, keep this in mind. The history of ancient Rome is not just about triumphs and monuments. It is about the unseen workers who carried the weight of empire on their shoulders, often until those shoulders broke. Tonight, we will walk in their footsteps. We will stand in the mines, in the furnaces, in the arenas, and in the shadows of temples to uncover the professions. So perilous, they could rightfully be called the deadliest jobs of the ancient world. So, settle in. The story you are about to hear is not one of emperors' speeches or military campaigns. It is the story of ordinary men and women whose names we will never know, but whose risks carved Rome into the world's memory. And as we journey through these forgotten professions, I'll ask you again to reflect. How safe is your work compared to theirs? And more importantly, would you have survived in their place? Beneath the Colosseum, night was never silent. Torches sputtered against damp stone walls, smoke trailing upward into the labyrinth of corridors. From the shadows came the sound that froze even hardened gladiators in their tracks, the rattling of iron bars, the scrape of claws against cage doors, the guttural growl of beasts that did not belong to Rome but had been dragged here from the farthest corners of the empire. Leopards shipped from the rocky coasts of North Africa, half-starved, to make them hungrier. Tigers, stolen from distant India, pacing in restless fury. Bears hauled from the frozen forests of Germania. Even elephants, towering and furious after months of brutal marshes, swayed on their chains, slamming tusks into wooden barriers that cracked under the strain. The ground itself trembled when these creatures roared, and the men tasked with keeping them under control knew the truth. They were one mistake away from being torn to pieces. These men were the Venator shadows, the animal trainers. History rarely records their names, but their presence haunted every spectacle. Before the crowd even took their seats, before a single gladiator raised a sword, these workers had already stared death in the eye. Their jobs were simple in description, yet terrifying in practice. Feed the beasts, transport them, prepare them for combat, and release them into the arena at just the right moment. But simplicity on paper did not translate to safety in reality. Feeding a lion wasn't a matter of tossing meat over a wall. Trainers stepped into cages, armed with nothing but a staff, a whip, and their nerve. One slip of the boot on blood-slick straw, one moment of hesitation while securing a gate, and the outcome was certain. The animal lunged, claws raked, jaws snapped shut, and no one risked entering the cage to drag the trainer's body back. The suspense of those moments was unbearable. Imagine holding a slab of raw meat in your hand, the smell driving the lion to frenzy, its amber eyes locked onto yours as though you yourself were the meal. Imagine the tremor of the bars as the beast hurled itself against them, the iron shrieking like thunder in the confined corridors. Every feeding was a gamble. Every day survived was a small victory. The Empire did nothing to soften the danger. In fact, it often heightened it. Trainers were ordered to starve animals before games, ensuring they would be more violent, more dramatic for the crowd. They baited the beasts with wooden dummies soaked in blood, conditioning them to attack on sight. They lit torches in the faces of elephants to keep them agitated, lashing their trunks until the massive creatures charged blindly into the sand. To the Romans above, these were thrilling displays of power. To the men below, they were acts of survival. The fallout of this profession was as bloody as the games themselves. There are accounts of trainers being dragged into cages, shredded within seconds by the very animals they sought to control. Some were mauled in the holding chambers before the beasts ever saw the light of the arena. Ships carrying exotic predators sometimes became floating prisons of chaos, with handlers torn apart mid-voyage. And when things went wrong during the games, it was often the trainers who were sacrificed first, thrown into the sand alongside the beasts to buy time while soldiers rallied. Picture this. The gates rise, and a tiger bursts into the sunlight, its muscles coiled with hunger. The crowd roars with excitement, but backstage, panic has already erupted. A handler failed to secure the second chain. The tiger lashes back toward the holding corridor, tearing into the men behind the scenes. For the audience, the spectacle remains seamless. They see only the drama in the arena. But behind the curtain, death is quiet, fast, and unacknowledged. Ask yourself, would you take that job? Would you trade your office, your tools, or your classroom for a torch and a whip, walking daily into the jaws of lions? These trainers did not choose their fate freely. Many were enslaved, others condemned prisoners. Some were criminals whose punishment was not execution but servitude in the cages. Yet a handful were free men spatialists who took on the role for pay, prestige, or the faint hope of avoiding poverty. Their skill with animals might buy them survival, but it also chained them to constant peril. And here lies the chilling truth. Rome didn't care if they lived or died. The empire had endless replacements, slaves, captives, debtors. If a trainer was mauled, his death wasn't a tragedy, it was a footnote. The games continued, the crowd cheered, and the emperor smiled. The expendable lives of these men fueled the endless appetite of spectacle. So the next time you picture the Colosseum filled with roaring beasts and clashing swords, remember the hidden figures in the shadows, the ones who coaxed half-starved. Predators from their cages, who held their breath each time an iron gate groaned open. Who knew that at any moment the sand might drink their blood instead of the gladiators. Their work was not honored. Their names were not recorded. Yet without them, Rome's greatest spectacles would never have existed. They lived every day, with death brushing at their heels, and more often than not, death caught up. And as terrible as this sounds, these animal trainers were only the first link in the Colosseum's deadly chain of professions. Others stood in workshops, hammering weapons that decided life or death. Others knelt in the sand, stitching wounds under the gaze of the emperor himself. If the cages were a place of constant suspense, the armories and infirmaries were no less haunted. And it is to those shadows that we turn next. Step away from the roaring cages of the beasts and follow the sound of hammer against iron. Deep within the Colosseum's hidden chambers lay another world entirely, one that smelled not of blood and straw, but of smoke, oil, and molten metal. This was the domain of the weapons masters, the unseen craftsmen whose work shaped the fate of every gladiator who walked onto the sand. Picture it, a forge glowing in the half-dark, the air heavy with heat, sparks flying like fireflies as iron is struck again and again on the anvil. Grindstones hiss as edges are sharpened, the rhythm of stone against blade echoing like a heartbeat through the chamber. The tension here was no less suffocating than in the animal pens above. For in this place, the smallest error did not simply ruin a weapon, it ruined a man's life. Every sword, every dagger, Every spear carried into combat bore the silent touch of these craftsmen. Their responsibility was immense. A blade had to be balanced to the hand, sharp enough to slice in an instant, strong enough to withstand the crushing force of an opponent's strike. A dull edge could mean a wound that failed to stop an enemy. A brittle spine could snap on impact, leaving its wielder defenseless in front of 50,000 roaring spectators. For the gladiator, trust in his weapon was trust in his survival, and that trust lay entirely in the hands of someone working in the shadows. This was not artistry for beauty's sake. This was artistry for survival, and the stakes were cruel. If a blade bent or shattered in the arena, it was not only the gladiator who suffered. The weapons master's reputation, and often his life, stood trial alongside the man who wielded the steel. A mistake could mean flogging, imprisonment, or worse, condemnation to the sands themselves, forced to fight with the very weapons they had once forged. Imagine that reversal. One day you are sharpening a gladius, the next day you are thrust into the arena, clutching it desperately as the crowd demands your blood. The drama of their work was constant. Fire licked at their hands, sparks scarred their faces, blades slipped and cut through flesh with the same ease they were designed to cut through armor. The grindstone could seize a weapon, spinning it from their grip and into bone. Their lungs, filled with smoke and ash, slowly poisoning them over years of labor. Many weapons masters bore the permanent marks of their craft: missing fingers, burned arms, eyes clouded by accidents at the forge. But the danger was not only physical, it was psychological. Consider the weight of knowing that your grindstone may determine whether a man returns to his cell alive or is carried out on a stretcher. Consider the burden of every edge you failed to hone, every weapon that may falter when it matters most. These men lived with the knowledge that steel, once it left their hands, could carry another's soul with it. And here's the chilling thought: gladiators had no choice but to place their lives in this trust. They picked up their weapons and fought, never knowing if the craftsman behind the forge had been skilled, rushed, careless, or distracted. Now ask yourself, would you trust your life to a stranger's grindstone? Would you walk into combat knowing that one unseen error could turn your fight into a death sentence? Weapons masters also carried the impossible responsibility of balance. Too sharp, and a blade snapped after one vicious strike. Too heavy, and a gladiator's arm grew slow and clumsy. Too light, and it lacked the force to kill. They worked with mathematical precision before mathematics had been codified, sculpting steel by instinct and experience, often under the watchful eyes of overseers demanding speed and perfection in equal measure. The irony was bitter. If they succeeded, no one noticed. The crowd cheered the gladiator's skill. The emperor judged the fight, and the craftsman remained invisible. If they failed, however, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The Colosseum was merciless, not only to fighters, but to those who supported them. And yet, despite the danger, some sought this path willingly. Freedmen and poor citizens took apprenticeships, learning to hammer steel in hopes of steady work. Others inherited the trade through family lines, fathers teaching sons to temper blades in the same fires that scarred their own hands. For them, the forge was not just survival, it was a way to carve meaning into their anonymity. Even if history forgot their names, still, every clang of the hammer carried tension. Every hiss of the grindstone was a reminder that death hovered close. These were not glamorous artisans. They were men whose craft was measured in heartbeats on the sand above. So as you imagine the gladiators locked in battle, their swords flashing in the sun, remember the unseen masters in the forge. Their sweat coated the blades. Their mistakes bled into the sand. Their unseen hands carried just as much responsibility for life and death as the fighters themselves. And this was only one profession in the Colosseum's deadly ecosystem. If weapons masters held life in their fire and steel, the next group, the arena's medics, held it in their bloodied hands. But were they healers or accomplices to cruelty? That question waits just beyond the gates. The crowd roared like a storm, its thunder rolling through the Colosseum. A steel clashed and blood spattered the sand. Beneath the deafening cries of 50,000 spectators, another group of men waited in silence, tense and watchful. They carried no swords, no shields, no armor. Their tools were knives, clamps, bandages, and basins. They were the arena's medical staff, men who lived in the narrow space between death and survival, forced to sprint onto the sand while blood still poured from open wounds. Picture it. A gladiator falls, his leg shattered by a hammer strike. The crowd surges with excitement, some demanding mercy, others howling for death. The referee signals, and suddenly the medics rush forward, kneeling in the dust as the injured man writhes in agony. There are no sterile gloves, no antiseptics, no quiet chambers. Just torn flesh, sand sticking to the blood, and the jeers of thousands demanding the show go on. With crude tools, they splint bones, cauterize bleeding vessels, and stitch wounds. Right there on the arena floor. Every second is a battle against time, infection, and the chaos raging around them. The suspense of their work was constant. At any moment, a wounded fighter could lash out in delirium. An enraged beast might break free from its chain, charging not only the gladiators, but the men trying to patch them up. These medics operated with danger pressing in from all sides, never knowing if they themselves might leave the arena alive. But here lies the darker question. Were these men truly healers? Or something far colder? For the gladiators they treated were often not citizens but slaves, prisoners, or the condemned. The care given was rarely about compassion. It was about utility. To Rome, a gladiator was an investment, and the medic's job was to keep that investment alive, just long enough to spill more blood for the crowd. Imagine being stitched together, with crude sutures only to be shoved back into combat minutes later. Picture a broken arm strapped hastily with splints so the fighter could grip a weapon again. Pain was ignored, infection was inevitable, and survival was a gamble. The medic's purpose was not to restore health, but to maintain the spectacle. A fighter who survived longer drew more cheers, and a gladiator who lived to fight again saved money for the empire. In this way, the line between healer and executioner blurred until it almost disappeared. And yet, it was not so simple. Some of these physicians were skilled men, trained in the traditions of Greek medicine, experimenting with herbs, cauterization, and even primitive surgery. They learned from battlefield wounds, from dissected animals, from the brutal education of trial and error. In some ways, the Colosseum became a grim laboratory, advancing medical techniques at a terrible cost. Their work may have kept gladiators alive, but it also left a legacy of knowledge carried into later centuries. Still, their role carried unbearable controversy. To the fighters, were they saviors or tormentors prolonging suffering? To thee, Empire, they were indispensable, but never honored. The crowd never cheered the medic who'd bound a wound. No statues were raised in their name. They existed as another cog in the machinery of death, essential but invisible. Now ask yourself if you were one of those medics, kneeling in the blood-soaked sand while the Emperor watched from above. Would you dare show mercy to the fighter begging for release? Or would you do as ordered, patch him up and send him back to die another day? Could you live with the knowledge that your skill did not save lives so much as extend suffering? Their danger was not only moral, but physical. They worked with constant exposure to blood, pus, and disease in an age with no understanding of contagion. A single cut on their hand, a drop of infected blood, could spell a slow and painful death. And unlike gladiators, who at least had the chance of victory and fame, the medics earned no glory, no honor, only the risk of vanishing quietly into history's silence. The Colosseum was a theater of blood, and the medics were its stagehands. Of survival force to work in shadows, their role both vital and cruel. They kept Rome's spectacle alive, but at what cost to themselves and to the men they stitched back together? And here is the truth you must carry forward. As brutal as their work was, the arena was only a fragment of Rome's dangers. Outside, those walls lay industries far worse mines, where poisonous dust consumed lungs, furnaces that blinded and burned, construction sites that swallowed men whole beneath collapsing stone. If the Colosseum was a showcase of danger, the Empire's labor fields were its endless graveyards. So as the crowd cheers above the sand, remember the medics kneeling below, fighting to hold lives together with shaking hands, not out of compassion, but out of necessity. Embrace yourself, because the horrors of Rome's everyday work will make even the blood-soaked arena seem merciful. The Colosseum's bloodshed was spectacular, but at least it was visible. The crowd saw the violence, heard the cries, felt the tension in the air. Beyond the walls of Rome, however, there were other battles being fought in silence darker, slower deaths that unfolded far from the roar of spectators. Among the deadliest of these hidden worlds were the lead mines, a place where men descended into darkness each day knowing they might never emerge whole again. Picture the scene. The hills of Hispania or Gaul scarred with jagged wounds where the earth had been torn open. The entrance to the mine yawns like a black mouth, swallowing the sun. Workers, slaves, criminals, the desperate poor shuffle inside carrying flickering oil lamps. The deeper they go, the air thickens, heavy with dust and fumes. The sound of iron picks echoes against stone walls as the tunnels grow narrower and the light begins to fail. Hours pass. Daylight vanishes. The air becomes poison. The miners worked bent double in cramped shafts, their skin slick with sweat, their lungs burning with every breath. They hacked at the ore with crude tools, filling baskets that were hauled to the surface by exhausted teams of mules and men. But the true enemy wasn't the collapsing tunnels or the falling rock, it was the invisible poison clinging to every breath, every handful of dust, every drop of water that ran through the mine's veins. Lead dot at first, the signs seemed small. A miner's hand shook as he tried to lift his pick. His legs grew weak, stumbling over stones. His speech slurred. Then the symptoms worsened. Tremors became uncontrollable. Madness set in, twisting thoughts into confusion and rage. Some miners collapsed mid-strike, their bodies convulsing in the dirt. Others withered slowly, their muscles wasting away while their skin turned pale and sickly. And still the overseers forced them deeper into the shafts, replacing those who died with new bodies dragged from the Empire's endless supply of slaves and prisoners. Lead poisoning was relentless. It crippled the men who labored in the mines, but the poison didn't stay underground. It clung to the ore, to the dust on their clothes, to the very metal carried back to Rome. From the mines, lead seeped into every corner of Roman life. Pipes that carried water through aqueducts and fountains were lined with it. Cooking pots, goblets, and utensils were cast from it. Wealthy women painted their faces with lead-based cosmetics to achieve the pale complexion of fashion, not knowing. The powder ate slowly into their flesh. Even wine was laced with a syrup boiled in lead, pots to sweeten its taste. Rome's obsession with this toxic metal spread its curse far beyond the miners who dug it from the earth. Senators in their marble halls, matrons in their villas, children splashing in, fountains all inhaled, drank, and consumed traces of the same poison that killed slaves by the thousands underground. Death was not always immediate. It was a creeping, invisible sickness that worked its way into bones, blood, and minds. Some historians even wonder if Rome's reliance on lead played a role in its eventual decline, weakening its people from within. Imagine waking each day to walk into those tunnels. No sun, no air. No escape from the invisible killer that lived in the very dust you breathed. Could you swing a pick, knowing each strike carved not only the stone but years off your life? Could you watch your fellow workers collapse one by one, knowing you were next? And imagine the bitter irony while emperors bathed in marble halls, and citizens poured water from gleaming fountains. The very luxury they enjoyed carried the fingerprints of poisoned miners, who never lived long enough to see the empire they sustained. The grandeur of Rome stood on foundations of sickness, its beauty shadowed by the slow, silent deaths of those buried alive in darkness. The Colosseum's spectacles might horrify us with their violence, but at least they were honest in their brutality. The mines were worse. They killed quietly, invisibly, without applause, without acknowledgement. Men did not die as warriors or martyrs. There, they simply wasted away, vanishing into the empire's hunger for metal. And this is only the beginning of Rome's industrial horrors. For beyond the mines lay other professions where danger burned in every breath and every ember. Glass furnaces that blinded apprentices with molten rivers of fire. Construction sites where entire crews were crushed beneath collapsing stone. If the mines poised Rome slowly, these industries consumed men in an instant. The games were brutal. The mines were merciless. But what came next was fiery, blinding, and every bit as fatal. Step away from the choking dust of the mines and into a different kind of inferno. Here, the air shimmered with heat so intense it bent light itself. The smell of smoke and burning sand filled every corner. At the heart of this workshop were furnaces, massive stone mouths that glowed with molten fire, consuming everything fed into them. Inside these roaring kilns, rivers of glowing liquid glass swirled like lava, dazzling in their beauty and terrifying in their danger. Glass was one of Rome's prized luxuries. Translucent cups, delicate vials for perfumes, intricate mosaics that caught sunlight like captured rainbows. These items decorated villas and temples, tokens of refinement and wealth. But behind every shimmering artifact stood workers who lived and labored on the knife's edge of disaster. The suspense of their craft was ever present. Imagine leaning close to a furnace, its heat blistering your skin as you dip a hollow pipe into the molten mass. You lift it slowly, turning carefully to shape the glowing blob at its tip. With a steady breath, you blow through the pipe, inflating the molten lump into form. The glass expands like a fragile bubble, soft and pliable. But one wrong movement, one breath too strong, one spin too quick and it shatters, spraying shards of fire across the room. The workers did this day after day, their lives balanced on the edge of explosion. Accidents were inevitable. When molten glass splattered, it clung to flesh, burning deep before it could be scraped away. Eyes clouded from exposure to searing heat. A single crack in a furnace wall could send fiery debris spraying outward like a storm of embers. Workers were blinded in an instant, their vision lost forever to a spark that landed wrong. Fingers fused into claws where molten drops had burned through skin and bone. Many apprentices bore scars before there were even men boys who entered the trade in their early teens, eager to learn a craft, but forever marked by fire before adulthood. The emotional weight of this reality is hard to overstate. These weren't warriors trained for combat, prepared to face death in the arena. These were craftsmen and children, drawn to the promise of steady work, only to discover that every day was a battle against a different kind of enemy. Instead of swords and beasts, their foe was fire itself, an enemy that never tired, never relented, and never forgave a single mistake. Imagine being a parent in ancient Rome, sending your son to apprentice in a glass workshop. You dream of him learning a valuable trade, shaping objects admired by nobles, securing a better future. Instead, he returns home with blistered hands, scarred arms, or worse, with no sight left in his eyes, robbed of his future before it even began, and yet the empire demanded more. Glass wasn't just a luxury, it was a booming industry. Vials held the perfumes and oils that scented wealthy banquets. Goblets gleamed on senators' tables. Decorative panes adorned temples, catching the sun in dazzling displays of wealth. Rome's hunger for beauty meant workers were expendable. If one apprentice lost his sight, another stepped forward to take his place at the furnace. If one craftsman's lungs burned out from inhaling smoke and ash, another was ready to breathe in his stead. The workshop never slept, the furnaces never cooled, and the fire claimed its victims quietly, without applause or recognition. The danger also left its mark on the city itself. Glass furnaces required enormous amounts of fuel, wood, charcoal, anything that could feed their hungry flames. Fires sparked easily in crowded districts, spreading from workshops to homes, reducing entire neighborhoods to ash. For every goblet or mosaic completed, the price was paid not only in scars and blindness, but sometimes in entire blocks of Rome reduced to smoldering ruins. Ask yourself, could you step into that workshop? Could you stand so close to fire that your skin cracked, your breath burned, and your future depended on the strength of your lungs and the steadiness of your hands? Could you trust your own child to such a craft, knowing the risk was not if? They'd be scarred, but when? Rome's history books rarely linger on these artisans. They celebrate the finished products, the shimmering mosaics, the delicate vials found in tombs, the fragments displayed in museums today. But behind every piece was a craftsman who risked blindness, burns, and death to give Rome its beauty. Their pain is invisible in the artifacts, yet it was carved into their bodies and lives with every fiery breath. The Colosseum shocked with its brutality, the mines poised with their dust, and the furnaces seared with fire. But the story does not end here. Beyond the furnaces, another danger awaited construction. Monuments of stone that symbolized Rome's eternal glory were built not by gods, but by men whose lives dangled from scaffolds, whose bones lay buried beneath collapsing walls. If fire scarred Rome's artisans, stone would crush its builders. And the next story reveals just how deadly the empire's obsession with building truly was. Rome's greatness was carved not only in blood but in stone. Its bridges stretched across rivers like the arms of giants. Its aqueducts carried water for miles, threading through mountains and valleys with impossible precision. Its amphitheaters, soared skyward, layered in arches that defied belief. Even today, centuries later, these structures still stand as testaments to Roman ambition. But beneath their grandeur lies a truth rarely told. They were monuments not just of engineering, brilliant, but of human sacrifice. The drama of Roman construction was constant, relentless, and often fatal. Picture scaffolds rising along the side of an aqueduct, wooden poles lashed together with rope, swaying in the wind as men climbed higher and higher. There were no safety rails, no harnesses, no nets. A single misstep meant a plunge from dizzying heights, the body dashed against stone below. Imagine standing on a beam, the world spinning beneath you, as you and your fellow laborers hoist a block weighing several tons into place. The ropes creak, the pulley strains. One slip, and the stone falls, not only shattering on the ground, but crushing anyone unlucky enough to be in its path. Rome's engineers were visionary, but they were also ruthless. Projects demanded speed and scale. Thousands of workers were pressed into service. Slaves captured in war, criminals sentenced to labor, and poor citizens desperate for coin. They worked from dawn to dusk in blistering sun and biting cold, carrying stone, mixing mortar, and lifting loads that broke their backs. Injury was inevitable. A twisted ankle on unstable scaffolding, a crushed hand caught between stone blocks, a skull fractured by falling debris. These were not rare accidents, they were daily realities. Suspense was built into every task. Imagine crossing a half-completed bridge with nothing beneath you but a skeleton of wood. The river roars below, waiting to swallow anyone who slips. Your only lifeline is the grip of your own hands and the balance of your tired legs. Or imagine being ordered to work deep inside the foundations of a new amphitheater, where tongues of stone loom above, the ceiling groaning under pressure. At any moment, the earth can shift, the structure can collapse, and the darkness becomes your tomb. And yet, the empire demanded progress. The pace was merciless. New arenas, temples, and aqueducts meant prestige for emperors and senators. The deaths of workers were simply part of the cost. No records were kept of their names. No monuments marked their graves. When scaffolding collapsed, killing dozens, the debris was cleared and construction resumed. When an aqueduct's arch fell mid-build, burying the men beneath it, their bodies were often entombed within the very structure they were building. Here lies the chilling thought. The buildings admired today, those stone marvels tourists photograph, those ruins hailed as wonders of the ancient world, may quite literally be standing on unmarked graves. Beneath the arches of aqueducts, beneath the steps of amphitheaters, beneath the paved stones of roads, there are bones of men whose labor ended in disaster. Their lives became part of the foundation, forgotten as the empire marched forward. Ask yourself, when you see the Colosseum's towering walls, or the aqueducts stretching like ribbons across the countryside, do you see only the glory of Rome, or do you see the invisible workers who paid with their lives? Would you still admire the engineering if you knew the structure you touched might be a tomb? The emotional weight of this truth is staggering. These were not warriors seeking honor in battle. They were laborers seeking survival, often enslaved or forced. They did not enter their work with the chance of glory, but with the certainty of risk. Fathers left their families each morning to climb scaffolds they might not descend from. Boys apprenticed in masonry carried bricks heavier than their bodies until their spines gave out. Men buried alive in collapsed tunnels were simply replaced by new crews. And yet Rome called it progress. Senators boasted of aqueducts bringing clean water, of temples rivaling the heavens, of arenas that could hold entire cities within their walls. They celebrated the brilliance of the architects and engineers, but the nameless laborers who bent their backs beneath the stones vanished into silence. Suspense, drama, and danger were not accidents of Roman construction. They were guarantees. Every monument demanded lives. Every structure cast a shadow that stretched over unseen graves. So the next time you see a Roman ruin standing proud against the sky, pause and look closer. Behind the beauty, behind the genius of Roman engineering, lies a hidden cost. Men who climbed too high, who carried too much, who fell too far. Men whose bones may still rest within the walls they helped build. The Colosseum was a theater of blood. The mines, a pit of poison. The furnaces, an inferno of fire. But the construction, sights of Rome were silent killers, swallowing lives into stone. And as we leave these towering monuments, we step into an even stranger realm of deadly labor occupations so unusual, so cruel, and so bizarre that they seem drawn from nightmares. Rome's hunger for spectacle and luxury demanded not only blood and stone, but flesh burned as torches, dyes extracted from rot, and beasts shipped across oceans. The deadliest jobs of all were sometimes the most unexpected. Of all the symbols of Roman power, none was more coveted, more carefully guarded than a single color: purple. It was not just a shade, it was a statement, the mark of emperors and the most powerful elites. The robes of senators, the cloaks of generals, the ceremonial garments of emperors themselves glowed with this deep, almost luminous hue. It was known as Tyrian purple, and it was more valuable than gold. But what history often forgets is how that color was made, and at what cost. The suspense begins not in palaces or temples, but along the foul-smelling shores, where workers hunched over baskets filled with heaps of shellfish. The prized dye came from the murex snail, a small sea creature with a gland no larger than a fingernail. To harvest it, thousands upon thousands of these snails were collected, cracked open, and left to rot in giant vats. Imagine the stench mountains of crushed shells and decomposing flesh fermenting under the Mediterranean sun, releasing fumes so vile they could make men gag and faint. The process was grueling. Workers labored knee-deep in this rotting mass, hands raw from breaking shells, lungs seared by the stench. To extract just a few grams of usable dye required tens of thousands of snails, their bodies piled high, left to fester until the glands could be removed. The suspense never ended, because these vats were more than disgusting, they were deadly. Here lies the reveal. Those fumes weren't just foul, they were toxic. Inhaling them day after day scarred lungs, burned throats, and left workers gasping for air. Chemical burns seared their skin when the liquid splashed. Eyes watered and blurred until blindness crept in. The dye itself, once refined, was corrosive, staining skin in ways that never fully washed away. Men who worked in these pits carried permanent marks, their hands discolored, their skin ulcered, their breath short and wheezing. And yet, the work never stopped. The demand for purple was insatiable. Roman law even declared it a privilege of the powerful. Only emperors could wear full purple robes. Senators were allowed a single stripe. Ordinary citizens, caught in garments dyed with the sacred color, could be punished harshly. Purple was not just fashion, it was power, a visible reminder of who ruled and who obeyed. But that power was woven directly from the suffering of nameless laborers. Think about the cruel irony. The more magnificent the garment, the more men had suffered to make it. An emperor's cloak required thousands of snails, harvested by dozens of workers whose lungs filled with poisonous fumes. A senator's robe might gleam with status, but it carried in its threads the stench of death. Beauty and prestige were built on rot, and those who displayed it proudly rarely gave a thought to the hands that made it possible. The fallout was immense. Workers lived short lives, their bodies ravaged by the invisible poison of their trade. Entire coastal towns dedicated to dye production stank so strongly of decay that they became infamous throughout the empire. Visitors gagged, unable to stay long, while locals endured the smell daily until their bodies gave out. Children born in these towns grew up surrounded by toxic air, their health broken before they reached adulthood. And yet, Rome called it progress. Rome called it beauty, when emperors draped themselves in flowing purple. They weren't just wearing a garment, they were wearing a shroud woven from countless invisible deaths. It was the ultimate symbol of the empire's hierarchy, one man's. Luxury purchased by the suffering of many. Ask yourself when you see images of emperors clad in purple, do you see glory? Or do you see the workers who suffocated in vats of rotting shellfish so that a single man could shine? Could you wear such a garment, knowing it reeked of decay, knowing it carried the breath of dying laborers in its threads? The Romans, of course, never asked. To them, the color was divine, eternal, the very fabric of authority. But for the dye makers, each day was another step toward death. They were not celebrated, not honored, not remembered. Their lives ended quietly, their graves unmarked, their suffering invisible, and yet their work endured. Even centuries later, fragments of Roman cloth dyed in Tyrian purple still retain their rich hue, as vibrant as the day they were woven. The color outlasted the workers who created it. It outlasted the emperors who wore it. It even outlasted Rome itself. Only the scars on the invisible laborers faded, because history seldom records the names of those who died in service to fashion. So, the next time you imagine the Roman elite striding through marble halls draped in shimmering purple, remember what that color truly was. The stench of rotting shellfish, the cough of poisoned lungs, the burns of chemicals eating into flesh. Remember that behind the beauty was death, woven silently into every thread. And here lies the chilling transition. If purple dye was deadly in its creation, some of Rome's other unusual occupations were even crueler, more horrifying. For there were those condemned not to labor but to burn human torches set alight to amuse the emperor's guests. Compared to them, even the dye pits might seem merciful. Rome's arenas shocked the world with blood. Its mines poisoned men slowly in the dark. Its furnaces scarred children with fire. But perhaps the most chilling of all Rome's deadly occupations was one so cruel, so unimaginable, that it still horrifies us 2,000 years later. The condemned who were forced to burn alive as human torches. This grotesque practice reached its peak under the reign of Emperor Nero. To some, Nero was a patron of the arts. To others, he was a tyrant, a man consumed by paranoia and extravagance. But to the unfortunate souls chosen for his punishments, he was the architect of one of history's most inhumane spectacles. At his grand parties, when the sun fell and torches would normally have been lit, Nero instead chose to illuminate his gardens with fire drawn from human flesh. The reveal is almost too chilling to speak aloud. Slaves, criminals, and Christians accused of treason or disobedience were stripped, bound to stakes, and coated in pitch, oil, or resin. When the emperor desired, they were set alight. Their bodies became lanterns. Their screams became the background music to Nero's feasts. Their burning flesh, the scent that drifted among marble statues and fountains. Guests wandered gardens bathed in a glow that came not from flame alone, but from human lives extinguished. In agony, now imagine the emotional weight of those moments. Families forced to watch loved ones dragged away, their pleas ignored. Their tears meaningless against the cruelty of Rome's most powerful. Mothers seeing their sons bound, wives hearing the cries of husbands set ablaze, and the victims themselves, knowing that their death would not be remembered as martyrdom, not even as execution, but as spectacle entertainment for those who laughed and drank beneath their light. For those condemned, there was no dignity, no honor, no chance of survival, unlike a gladiator who could at least fight for his life, or a miner who might cling. 2 years of endurance, the living lanterns were stripped of all humanity. Their role was to burn, to cast light on Nero's feasts, to serve the empire not as men or women but as candles. Their final breaths were swallowed by fire, their bodies collapsing into ash while music played and goblets clinked. Consider the haunting irony. Rome prided itself on civilization, on law, on order. It built aqueducts and temples, boasted of justice and governance. Yet within its heart, under the command of its emperor, it turned people into object citizens, into torches, lives into fuel. The empire's glow was quite literally purchased with human pain. And here is where the engagement comes. Imagine yourself in that world. What would history remember you as? A citizen, safe beneath the banquet's glow, or a candle, consumed for the sake of someone else's pleasure? Would you stand with the laughing crowd? Or would you feel the fire's heat and hear the screams, knowing the empire's glory rested on human suffering? The fallout of this cruelty stretched beyond the flames. For those who witnessed it, trauma lingered. Families destroyed, communities terrorized, fear etched into every whispered conversation. The victims became warnings, burning billboards that told Rome's poor, enslaved, and rebellious what awaited them if they defied authority. The light of the torches carried a message. In Rome, lives were disposable, and the emperor's will was law. And yet, despite the horror, Nero's parties continued. Guests attended, entertained not only by music and performance but by the eerie, flickering glow of burning bodies. To refuse was to risk suspicion. To protest was to court death. So Romans mingled, drank, and applauded while men and women screamed. Behind them, history has not forgotten Nero, nor his atrocities. He is remembered as a tyrant who turned cruelty into theatre, who blurred the line between punishment and entertainment. But the names of the victims, the countless men and women, reduced to smoke are lost. Their ashes scattered, their suffering unrecorded, their existence remembered only in the cruel detail that they served as lamps. And this is the true tragedy. Rome immortalized emperors in marble, generals in triumphal arches, and gods in towering temples. But those forced to burn as torches were erased from memory, their only legacy the eerie glow of a garden party. They did not live as citizens, nor even die as criminals. They were transformed into objects, stripped of humanity entirely, reduced to fuel for spectacle. So the next time you see a Roman statue or ruin bathed in golden light, let your mind wander to those nights in Nero's gardens. Imagine the flicker of flames. Imagine the music, the laughter, the wine flowing freely. And then remember the true source of that light. Men and women screaming as they burned, their lives consumed for nothing more than entertainment. The Colosseum was brutal. The mines were merciless. The furnaces seared with fire. But this was cruelty elevated to art, pain transformed into pageantry. Rome's deadliest jobs did not always involve tools, or labor, or skill. Sometimes death itself was the occupation, and the body became the candle that lit the empire's darkest night. And if you think this was Rome's limit, you would be wrong. For beyond the torches, beyond the dye pits and the furnaces, another group courted danger in pursuit of spectacle, those tasked with importing wild beasts from across the empire. They risked seas, deserts, and claws to bring lions, elephants, and leopards to Rome. Compared to their world, even the torches might seem almost merciful. Rome's appetite for spectacle was boundless. Gladiators alone could not satisfy it. The roar of lions, the charge of elephants, the clash of leopards and bears, these were the sounds and sights that turned the Colosseum into a theater of living nightmares. But those beasts did not appear by magic. Before the crowd screamed in delight as an African lion leapt into the sand, before an elephant trumpeted in rage under the Roman sun, there were men who traveled the ends of the earth to bring them here. They were the exotic animal importers, and their profession was one of the deadliest in the empire. Suspense was their daily reality. Imagine caravans stretching across deserts, the horizon shimmering with heat, as wagons creaked under the weight of cages. Within them, lions snarled, panthers prowled, and bears swayed in their cramped prisons. Chains rattled with every step, the air thick with the stench of fear and filth. Guards marched with spears in hand, knowing that one broken bar or one slipped knot could turn the caravan into a massacre. At night, as the desert wind howled, the men slept uneasily, listening to the growls and screeches of their unwilling cargo. They knew that dawn might bring not just another mile of sand, but claws tearing through wood, or fangs sinking into flesh. For those tasked with bringing beasts by sea, the dangers multiplied. Picture ships groaning under the weight of cages. Stacked upon one another, the decks stained with urine, dung, and blood. Waves tossed the vessel, slamming the animals against their cages until bones broke and fury erupted. A storm could scatter ships across the sea, drowning sailors and animals alike. Rats and insects swarmed, spreading disease. Fever swept through the crew, leaving them too weak to control their feral passengers. At any moment, the balance between man and beast could collapse into chaos, and here is the brutal reveal. The death toll among these importers was staggering. Many never returned home. Some were mauled outright when an animal broke free mid-journey. Others wasted away from dysentery, fevers, or plague carried in cramped ships and desert caravans. Many simply vanished into the wilderness, cut down by raiders, storms, or exhaustion, their bodies left unmarked. Along the routes of empire, for every lion that padded into the Colosseum, there were countless men who died unseen. Their blood spilled not in front of cheering crowds, but in silence. On the roads and seas of Rome, even those who survived faced constant peril. Disease lingered in their lungs from weeks spent inhaling filth. Scars crisscrossed their bodies from close calls with claws and tusks. Some returned maimed, missing eyes, hands, or legs, living reminders of the Empire's hunger for spectacle. And yet their sacrifices went unnoticed. The crowd never saw them. The Emperor never honored them. They were shadows behind the curtain. Their work consumed the moment the gates of the arena opened and the beasts charged onto the sand. Think of the irony. Rome's citizens filled amphitheaters, marveling at the power and ferocity of creatures brought from across the world. They applauded as lions shredded condemned criminals, as elephants trampled gladiators, as exotic birds wheeled overhead. But no one thought of the journey that brought those animals, there the months of toil, the endless miles, the men who'd collapsed from disease or were torn apart in the attempt. Rome's hunger for entertainment devoured lives long before the show ever began. Ask yourself this haunting question. When you imagine the Colosseum filled with roaring beasts, do you hear only the cheers of the crowd? Or can ye also hear the echo of men screaming on storm-tossed decks, the shouts of caravan guards as chains broke, the silence of graves dug in the sand for those who never returned? Would you have taken such a job, knowing the pay might never reach your family, knowing that survival was the exception, not the rule? The fallout of this occupation stretched far beyond individual deaths. Whole communities were pressed into service to supply Rome's endless demand. Villages along trade routes became staging grounds where animals were caged, men were conscripted, and bodies were buried. Families lost fathers and sons to the caravans. Coastal towns watched ship after ship sail out with beasts and men, many of whom would never return. The Empire's spectacles were built not only on the deaths within the arena, but on the silent graves scattered across deserts, jungles, and seas. Rome celebrated itself as the master of the world. Its arenas declared dominance not only over men, but over nature itself. Yet the truth is that the Empire did not tame the beast. It consumed the men who carried them. Every lion that entered the Colosseum carried with it the ghosts of handlers who fell along the way. Every elephant that bowed before the emperor bore the cost of sailors drowned in storms. Every exotic spectacle came at the expense of countless invisible lives. So the next time you see an image of the Colosseum filled with wild animals, remember that the spectacle did not begin in Rome. It began thousands of miles away on desert roads, in jungle clearings, on storm-tossed ships, where men fought desperately to contain nature for the sake of an emperor's amusement. Remember that for every roar that thrilled the crowd, there were cries that went unheard. The Colosseum devoured its victims openly. The mines poisoned men quietly. The furnaces scarred them with fire. But the trade in exotic beasts was a global machine of death, swallowing lives on roads, seas, and battlefields long before the animals ever touched Roman sand. And if this strikes you as horrific, brace yourself. For Rome's hunger for labor and control reached beyond spectacle, beyond dye pits, beyond torches and caravans, even the everyday. Jobs of its poorest citizens, bakers, tavern workers, carried dangers we would scarcely imagine today. Compared to them, even the arena's shadows may seem merciful. The Colosseum shocked with its blood, the mines poisoned with their dust, the furnaces burned with fire, and caravans carried death across oceans. But not every deadly profession in Rome was grand or spectacular. Many of the empire's most perilous jobs were hidden in plain sight in bakeries, on city streets, in crowded taverns where the laughter of the poor masked a slow, invisible danger. These were the everyday occupations, the ordinary labors that kept Rome alive, and yet carried risks that destroyed countless lives without a single cheer from the crowd. At first glance, the baker's trade seemed harmless. Bread was Rome's lifeblood, the daily ration that kept citizens fed and kept riots at bay. Bakeries glowed with warmth in the early morning hours, the smell of fresh loaves drifting into streets as ovens roared. Customers came eagerly, children tugging at their mothers' hands for a piece of bread. It looked peaceful. But behind the counter, inside the workshops, the truth was suffocating. Roman bakers worked in rooms thick with flour dust. Clouds of fine powder filled the air as grain was ground, sifted, and knitted into dough. Without ventilation, every breath carried tiny particles deep into the lungs. At first, the irritation caused coughing fits, red eyes, and raw throats. But years of exposure scarred the lungs permanently. Bakers developed what we might now call baker's lung, a slow, suffocating disease that left them gasping for air, their chests tight, their breaths shallow, even as they tried to keep working. And the danger didn't end with the dust. The ovens themselves were monsters. Massive brick chambers heated by roaring fires. They glowed with lethal heat. Workers shoveled wood, leaned dangerously close to check loaves, and reached into ovens with long paddles. Burns were constant. Skin blistered, arms scarred. Apprentices, too young to understand the risks, often collapsed from heat stroke. Imagine working for hours in a room where the air shimmered like a furnace, your lungs filled with flour dust, your skin scorched by every brush against stone. Bread was the empire's comfort. For bakers, it was their death sentence. Step outside the bakery and into the streets of Rome, and another group of invisible workers kept the city functioning. The cleaners. Rome was immense, a city of over 1 million people, filled with animals. Markets, latrines, and sewers. Trash piled quickly. Human waste overflowed from cesspits. Animals left carcasses in alleyways. Without constant labor, disease would sweep through the population. The cleaners' work was filthy and endless. They hauled away excrement from public latrines. They dredged sewers clogged with waste and vermin. They scraped rotting meat and garbage from cobbled streets, the stench so strong it lingered in their clothes and skin. Rats scurried at their feet. Clouds of flies followed their every step. And with each day of labor, they exposed themselves to invisible killers' diseases. Spread by sewage, plagues carried in rats, fevers contracted from filth. Few envied their work. They were mocked, despised, treated as the lowest of the low. Yet without them, the city would collapse into chaos. The grandeur of Roman forums and temples depended on men who waded knee-deep in filth, and many of them died young, struck down. Not by swords or stones, but by fevers that consumed their bodies after years of exposure. Ask yourself, would you take such a job? Knowing that every breath you drew might carry disease, every cut on your skin might fester into infection. Would you walk the sewers of Rome so that others could live in marble palaces above? And then there were the taverns, the smoky, bustling heart of Rome's nightlife. Poor citizens, freedmen, and laborers crowded into these establishments too. Drink cheap wine, share gossip, and escape their daily hardships. To outsiders, tavern work seemed easier than hauling stone or fighting beasts. But the reality was far deadlier, because the very drink that filled the cups carried poison. Roman taverns often served wine stored in lead-lined vessels or sweetened with sapar syrup boiled down in lead pots. Customers drank eagerly, unaware that every sip carried a dose of poison. Tavern workers, however, bore the brunt of exposure. They handled the wine daily, inhaling vapors rising from storage jars, tasting to test quality, pouring cup after cup from tainted casks. Over time, their bodies betrayed them. The symptoms crept in slowly. First, headaches and fatigue, then trembling, hands, aching joints, and strange lapses of memory. Some grew violent, their minds clouded by madness. Others withered into weakness, their skin pale, their teeth crumbling, their bodies wasting away. They were poisoned not by a sudden catastrophe, but by the slow, invisible corrosion of lead. And all the while, their customers laughed, clinking cups, praising the sweetness of the wine that was slowly killing them both. The baker coughing himself, breathless by the oven, the street cleaner gasping from fever after a day in the sewers, the tavern worker trembling as lead stole his strength. These were not warriors, nor slaves in chains, nor gladiators in the arena. These were ordinary men, and women doing ordinary jobs we might think of as humble, even safe. Yet in Rome, even the most mundane tasks carried a sentence of death. This was the cruel irony of Roman life. The empire celebrated its emperors, generals, and engineers, but it was sustained by invisible laborers whose deaths were never recorded. Every loaf of bread, every clean street, every cup of wine carried the unseen cost of lives shortened by dust, disease, and poison. Now consider this. How many of Rome's monuments, how many of its banquets, how many of its triumphs would have been possible without these unseen sacrifices? Would the people have cheered in the Colosseum if they had not eaten bread baked by dying men? Would senators have debated in the Forum if the streets had overflowed with filth? Would emperors have toasted victories without wine poured from poisoned casks? Rome's greatness was not just carved in stone or fought with swords, it was sustained daily by quiet, anonymous workers who paid with their health and lives. And yet, as deadly as these everyday jobs were, they pale compared to what came next. For the deadliest job of all was not found in the arena, nor in the mines, nor in the sewers. It was found in the emperor's own palace, where proximity to power was itself a death sentence. To serve Rome's rulers meant living each day with paranoia, betrayal, and poison. The closer you stood to the emperor's table, the closer you stood to death. When we think of the emperor's palace, we imagine marble halls gleaming in torchlight, ceilings painted with gold, courtyards filled with fountains and gardens. It was the very center of Roman power, the beating heart of the empire. Two-step. Inside those walls was to stand close to unimaginable authority, to brush shoulders with senators, generals, and rulers whose decisions shaped the known world. But power in Rome was a dangerous gift. The closer you stood to it, the closer you stood to death. The palace was not a sanctuary, it was a trap where whispers, glances, and even meals carried lethal risk. Start with the food tasters, men whose role at first seemed enviable. They dined before the emperor himself, eating from the same golden platters, sipping from the same jeweled goblets. But theirs was not a privilege, it was a sentence. Every bite they took might be their last dart. Poison was the silent weapon of Roman politics. Rival senators, ambitious generals, even members of the imperial family plotted with powders and potions. A few drops slipped into wine, a dusting stirred into bread, and the mightiest ruler in the world could be undone without a sword raised. To guard against this, emperors demanded tasters, slaves, freedmen, or trusted guards who sampled every dish before it touched imperial lips. Imagine the suspense of that role. Sitting at the emperor's table, lifting a spoon to your mouth, knowing that at any moment your throat might seize, your stomach twist, your body convulse. Every swallow was a test. Every sigh of relief from the emperor came only after the taster had proven the food safe with his own body. But sometimes the poison was slow. Sometimes it lingered for hours, even days. That meant tasters lived in a state of constant paranoia, ever certain whether their last bite had already sealed their fate. Some tasters were celebrated for their loyalty. Others were forgotten the moment their bodies collapsed on the palace floor. They died silently so emperors could live, erased by the very system that demanded their sacrifice. And here is the cruelest irony. Many emperors still fell to poison, despite their precautions. The tasters' deaths brought only moments of safety, not certainty. Their lives were not shields, they were simply delays. If the tasters fought poison, with every meal, the palace scribes fought a different kind of danger, knowledge. These men lived in the empire's shadows, penning decrees, recording treaties, transcribing private letters. They were the keepers of secrets, too volatile to be spoken aloud. A misplaced word could spark a rebellion. A letter copied incorrectly could start a war. The tension was unrelenting, because in Rome, information was as sharp as any blade. Scribes sat bent over wax tablets and parchment, ink staining their fingers, listening to the words of emperors and generals. They knew alliances that could never be spoken, betrayals waiting to be revealed, plots woven in whispers behind closed doors. And for that reason, they lived with a constant threat. To speak even one word to many outside the palace was to sign their own death warrant. Executions were swift, often carried out in silence, a reminder to all others that the emperor's secrets were sacred and fatal. Some scribes vanished overnight, their absence explained by vague whispers of treachery. Others were forced into exile, stripped of name and rank. A few were tortured, their knowledge extracted by the very men they once served. To hold a reed pen in Rome's palace was not to wield influence, it was to cradle a dagger at one's throat. The more secrets you knew, the closer the blade pressed. Now picture yourself in their sandals. You've just copied an imperial decree sealing the fate of a province. You know armies will march, villages will burn, thousands will die because of the words you've transcribed. You know these truths, and yet you cannot speak them. Could you bear such a burden, living in silence, knowing that your loyalty was measured not by what you did, but by what you dared not say? Beyond the palace walls, another group risked their lives in service to the empire, the messengers, swift-footed, tireless. They carried war decrees, orders, and intelligence across Rome's vast dominion. Their routes took them through deserts, forests, and enemy lands. But it wasn't just terrain that threatened them, it was the messages themselves. In their satchels, they carried words that could topple kings or ignite wars. To intercept a messenger was to hold power in your hands. That meant they were hunted. Raiders ambushed them on lonely roads. Enemies captured them, tortured them, pried loose the secrets they carried. Some never made it to their destination, their bodies left in ditches, their scrolls seized by rival hands. Others pressed on despite wounds, limping into camps with blood staining the parchment, collapsing only after delivering their orders. Even when they weren't ambushed, nature itself was merciless. Torrential rains washed out roads. Snowstorms buried passers. Rivers swelled beyond crossing. And all while the message remained urgent. A delay could mean an army unprepared, a city left undefended, an emperor's wrath unleashed. Messengers carried not just scrolls, but the weight of Rome's survival, and that weight often crushed them. Here is the emotional truth that binds these palace professions together. Power in Rome was not protection, it was a ticking clock. The tasters, the scribes, the messengers, they all lived in the emperor's shadow, where danger was sharper, subtler, and more relentless than in any arena or mine. Proximity to power did not grant safety. It heightened the risk. Imagine living in those halls, surrounded by marble and gold, but knowing that death lurked in every goblet, every whisper, every sealed scroll. Imagine the paranoia of tasting food, for poison, of writing decrees that could doom you if revealed, of carrying messages that marked you as prey. The palace looked like the pinnacle of Rome's glory, but for those who served within it, it was a labyrinth of fear. Ask yourself, would you want to serve close to the emperor, basking in the splendor of his table and the majesty of his halls? Or would you see it for what it was, gilded cage, where survival was never guaranteed? And here lies our attention. As deadly as the palace was, it was still only one stage of Rome's lethal theater. Beyond those walls, religion and ritual carried their own cruel dangers. In temples, on altars, and in sacred vows, men and women faced fates every bit as unforgiving as the sword. To understand Rome's deadliest jobs, we must next step into the shadow of the gods themselves. Rome was an empire built not only on armies and stone, but on belief. Every victory, every festival, every decision of state was intertwined with the will of the gods. Temples rose high above the forum, altars smoked day and night, and sacrifices echoed with prayers meant to keep the empire favored. To be close to Rome's religion was to stand in awe of its divine power. But like the arena, like the mines, like the palace service to the gods, carried its own hidden dangers. For those bound to ritual, faith was no shield. It was often a death sentence. Among the most feared and revered figures in Roman religion were the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses charged with tending the eternal flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. From childhood, these girls were taken from their families and sworn to 30 years of service. Their vows were absolute: purity, obedience, vigilance. As long as the flame burned, Rome was safe. But if the fire ever went out, or if a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, the punishment was unthinkable. Suspense defined their lives. Every step was watched, every word weighed. A single rumor of disobedience could bring death. For the crime of impurity, Vestals were not executed by sword or flame, for their bodies were considered sacred. Instead, they were buried alive. Imagine being led to a chamber beneath the earth, given a small lamp and a little food, and left to die as there. Stones sealed the world away. The silence, the suffocating dark, the slow realization that prayers would not bring rescue. This was the fate of those who failed to meet vows that were humanly impossible. The irony was cruel. Women tasked with preserving Rome's survival were themselves disposable, sacrificed at the first shadow of suspicion. They lived in luxury compared to many, with privileges denied to other women of Rome, yet every moment of their lives was balanced on the knife's edge of fear. Was devotion to the goddess worth a lifetime of surveillance and the threat of a living grave? Beneath the grandeur of Rome's temples lay another class of workers, the men who prepared sacrifices, maintained altars, and kept the gods appeased through endless ritual. To worshippers, temples were sacred spaces filled with incense and chants, but to those who labored inside, they were suffocating, bloody workplaces where danger was constant. Imagine dawn at a temple. Animals, cattle, sheep, goats, even birds are brought forward for sacrifice. The priests raise knives, the chants echo, and blood flows across the altars. The workers must drag carcasses, butcher flesh, and burn fat and entrails in great fires that pour black smoke into the air. They stand knee-deep in blood, their hands slick, their lungs filled with choking fumes. The suspense of each ritual was not only spiritual, but physical. Fires flared high, blades slipped, heavy carcasses crushed men beneath their weight, and all the while, smoke carried unseen poisons into their lungs. Asthma, coughing fits, chronic illness all became lifelong companions. Cuts from sacrificial, knives or scratches from animals often festered, spreading infection in a time with no true cures. To serve the gods was to bleed quietly, to choke on sacred smoke until your strength was gone. And yet, no one honored the temple workers. The gods were praised, the priests celebrated, but those who carried the weight of sacrifice faded into obscurity, their health traded for ritual. Ask yourself, would you endure smoke and blood every day of your life, knowing your suffering was invisible, hidden behind chants and incense? But perhaps the most haunting dangers of all fell upon the men who built Rome's massive temples. Monuments raised not only to the gods but to human ambition. From the Pantheon to the Temple of Jupiter, these structures required stone blocks, weighing tons, columns towering high into the air, and statues carved from marble so massive they seemed alive. Picture scaffolds, swaying high above the ground as workers hauled columns with ropes and pulleys. Imagine standing beneath a stone image of a god, taller than any man, as it was lifted into place. A snapped rope, a broken beam, a single miscalculation, and men were crushed instantly, their bodies mangled beneath the weight of the divine. Temples stood as eternal monuments, but their foundations were laid in blood. Many who worked on these sites were slaves or prisoners, their deaths unmarked, their bodies buried in rubble or carried away without ceremony. Others were free men, skilled masons and engineers, but even their expertise could not shield them from falling stones, collapsing scaffolds, or accidents that ended lives in a heartbeat. The grandeur of Rome's gods was written in stone, but also in bones. Religion promised Rome protection, stability, and favor from the divine. But for those who served it, religion demanded lives. Vestal Virgins bound to vows that strangled freedom. Temple workers coughing their lives away in smoke and blood. Builders crushed beneath statues of the gods they helped raise. Their deaths were sacrifices every bit as real as the animals on the altars. Now pause and ask yourself, was devotion worth more than survival? Would you accept a vow that could bury you alive? Would you breathe in sacrificial smoke until your lungs failed? All four rituals that few remembered. Would you stand beneath a god's stone image, praying the ropes did not snap as it swung above your head? Rome demanded absolute faith, but gave no mercy to those who served. The gods received their temples, their sacrifices, their eternal flames, but the men and women who carried the burden paid with their lives. And yet, even these dangers, the vows, the smoke, the crushing stones, were not the end. For there was another class of invisible workers, nameless, faceless, who toiled not in temples or palaces, but in every corner of Roman life. Enslaved children, exhausted rowers, women bent beneath impossible labor, their suffering was quieter, but no less deadly. The empire called them shadows. History barely recorded them, and yet they formed the backbone of Rome itself. To understand the true scale of Rome's deadliest jobs, we must step into their world next. History remembers emperors, generals, and gladiators. It remembers the roar of the Colosseum, the triumph of legions, the marble of temples. But Rome did not stand on grandeur alone. It stood on the backs of millions of invisible workers' children, enslaved men and women whose lives were spent in silence and ended in shadows. Their labor was so common, so constant, that history hardly recorded it. Yet it was they who carried Rome's weight, and it was they who suffered the slowest, most merciless deaths. Suspense begins in the workshops where Rome's children labored. Apprenticeship was often hailed as opportunity, a chance for a boy to learn a trade, to rise above poverty. But behind the promise lay danger. Children as young as 8 were pressed into service. Their small bodies set 2 tasks too great for them. Imagine a boy in a glass workshop, standing near furnaces that glowed like suns. His job, pump the bellows, carry tools, fetch molten blobs of glass for the master. The heat scorches his skin, the fumes fill his lungs. One slip of the hand, and molten glass clings to his arm, fusing flesh and bone in an instant. Or picture another in a construction yard, tasked with hauling stones heavier than his frame, his spine bending under the load. These children did not grow old. They grew broken, even in trades considered safer: metalwork, textiles, carpentry. The dangers loomed. Sharp tools sliced through fingers, heavy looms crushed small hands. The dust of wool and dyes filled tender lungs. Apprenticeship was not merely training, it was endurance. Childhood ended the moment the work began, and for many, adulthood never came. If the children labored in silence, the enslaved miners and ship rowers suffered in chains. Nowhere was life shorter, more merciless than in the mines. We have already glimpsed the horrors of lead dust, but for the enslaved, the mines were more than deadly, they were final. Criminals and captives sent into the shafts were not expected to return. Their life expectancy was measured not in years, but in months. Picture the descent: narrow tunnels, air thick with choking dust, the weight of rock pressing from all sides. Torches sputter, barely lighting the path. The men swing picks until their muscles tremble, hauling baskets of ore until their backs split with pain. The air itself is poison, filling their lungs with lead, silver, or sulfur. Collapse was common. A tunnel gave way, burying dozens alive. For the Empire, it was no tragedy, only another order for more slaves. And then there were the rowers, shackled 2 benches deep within warships and merchant galleys. The suspense of their work was relentless. They rowed day and night, chained to oars heavier than their bodies, backs slick with sweat, hands blistered and bleeding. When storms struck, they were the first to drown, chained where they sat. When battles raged, flaming arrows rained down on their decks, and there was no escape. Their muscles powered Rome's navy, but their lives ended quietly, one by one, beneath the crash of waves. And then there were the women laboring in the shadows, their dangers quieter but no less deadly. In dye pits they stood knee-deep in vats of rotting mollusks or chemical brine, the stench clinging to their skin, the toxins seeping into their lungs. Their hands blistered and peeled, their bodies weakened by constant exposure. Few survived long in laundries. They worked with vats of ammonia collected from human urine used to bleach and clean cloth. Imagine standing in rooms filled with steam rising from boiling tubs of filth, your lungs burning with every breath, your skin raw from hours of exposure. The irony was cruel. Their labor kept Rome's wealthy clothed in spotless garments, while their own bodies decayed in silence. And in the brothels, women faced the deadliest occupation of all, not because of tools or fumes, but because of the human cruelty inflicted on them. Disease spread unchecked. Violence was constant. Many were enslaved, forced into service until their health collapsed. They were invisible, forgotten the moment their usefulness ended. Their lives were currency in Rome's appetite for pleasure, and their deaths were seldom acknowledged. Here lies the most haunting truth. The deadliest work in Rome wasn't always violent. It wasn't always dramatic, with swords, beasts, or collapsing stone. Often, it was slow. It was invisible. It was in the flour dust that scarred bakers' lungs, in the fumes that ate away dye workers' flesh, in the chains that bound rowers to benches until their hearts gave out. Death came not with a roar, but with a whisper, creeping day by day until bodies failed and lives ended without witness. Ask yourself this: would you rather face the sword in the arena, your death quick and remembered, or spend years slowly poisoned, suffocated and broken, only to vanish unrecorded in the shadows? Was survival worth the slow death of silence? Rome's glory rested not only on the spectacular sacrifices of gladiators or the sudden disasters of collapsing scaffolds. It rested on the unseen millions who labored without recognition, whose deaths were not cheered or mourned. They were the invisible workers the children robbed of youth, the enslaved who knew freedom only in death, the women who carried Rome's burdens in silence. And yet, as dark as their stories are, one truth still waits to be told. The empire's deadliest work was not in the mines, nor in the dye pits, nor even in the brothels. It was not slow poisoning or suffocation. It was the invisible danger of being close to Rome's power itself. For in the palace, in the shadow of the emperor, the greatest peril was not in labor, but in loyalty. And loyalty, in Rome, was always paid for in blood. While you rest safely tonight, consider the sound of Rome as it once was. The roar of lions from their cages, the clang of hammers striking molten steel, the coughs of bakers gasping through flour dust, the chants of priests rising over smoke and blood. Beneath the marble temples and triumphant arches, beneath the feasts and parades, there was another rhythm. The rhythm of labor, of suffering, of lives spent and forgotten. That rhythm still echoes today, faint but unbroken, carried in history's silence. From the hook we began with the torchlight flickering across cages, men walking into the arena knowing they might never return. We have seen the truth. Rome's grandeur was never free. It was purchased in flesh. Gladiators fought and died to entertain crowds. Trainers fed beasts that might kill them at any moment. Miners suffocated in tunnels. Rowers wasted away, chained to benches. Children scarred their bodies before their voices even deepened. Women labored in dye pits, laundries, and brothels, their lives reduced to toil and silence. Even those closest to the emperor lived in paranoia, each meal, each word, each journey a gamble with death. Human life, in Rome, was treated as fuel for empire, cheap, expendable, and replaceable. If a slave died in a mine, another was dragged into his place. If a baker collapsed beside an oven, another apprentice was waiting to take up the paddle. If a scribe was executed for whispering a secret, another hand was ready to dip the pen. Rome's glory rose high, but its foundation was built on countless invisible graves. And yet, when we look to the modern world, there is both distance and resonance. Today, we work in offices, factories, hospitals, and schools. We face risks, yes, but we also expect protection. We trust in safety harnesses, in labor laws, in fire codes and inspections. We demand workplaces that guard our survival rather than gamble it away. But history reminds us that this expectation is recent, fragile, and hard-won. For centuries, men and women, like Rome's invisible workers, lived and died without that protection. And even now, in parts of the world, there are ecos miners, choking on dust, children pressed into unsafe labor, workers treated as replaceable cogs rather than human beings. Ask yourself, what's the most dangerous job you would dare take on? Would you risk your life for spectacle as a gladiator? Would you endure poison in the mines for silver that only others would enjoy? Would you carry secrets that could end your life with a single misplaced word? Or would you gamble each breath in silence, knowing that your work kept the world alive but left you unremembered? History forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Progress is often built on the lives of those history does not name. But we, living safely today, can choose to remember them, to acknowledge that every stone of Rome's glory was carried by hands that trembled, bled, and broke. Their labor may echo beneath history's silence, but by speaking of them, we bring those echoes back to life. And so, as you close your eyes tonight, safe in your home, remember this. The greatest empire the world had ever seen rose on the backs of men, women, and children whose lives were extinguished not in war, but in work. Their stories remind us the survival is never guaranteed, the safety is not universal, and that every comfort we enjoy today is built on the struggles of those who came before. This story ends here, but another waits just beyond the gates of history, because the deadliest jobs were not Rome's only secrets. There were daily rituals, hidden practices, and quiet truths about ordinary life that the empire never wanted remembered.